In the meantime, we have our first guest here. Welcome, this is Markus Allen. Welcome, Markus.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here.
Thanks, yes, we're delighted to have you. Markus, you gave a lecture today on the backgrounds of the moon landing. It is of course, since the first moon landing, that there are a lot of rumors about the actual justness and the rightness of the whole thing. You have got a different story. What is this story based upon? We've all seen taking those rockets off and having all this, seeing these pictures from space during the travel. What has been happening there?
Well, the rocket took off as we all watched it. We all watched it take off. And we watched it land. Well, the capsule came down with the parachutes on it. Well, you have to remember that the information between those two events, the takeoff and the landing, was supplied by NASA. Nobody else investigated it, nobody else had access to the communication. NASA tells us what is happening. The astronauts land on the moon, we're told. They take photographs, they walk around, they come back to Earth, they get a big hero's welcome. And we all believe that this is what happened, that they landed on the moon. They took the photographs and we see the photographs and we think, wow, man has landed on the moon, this is a great achievement.
When, for the first time, started people to get suspicious about what NASA was telling us?
I first started to question some of the, because I watched it live. I'm old enough to have watched it live, and I saw this and I believed it. For 25 years I believed it, until I heard a talk given in England by an American, as it happens, who said, oh, of course the photographs of the moon landings, they've been fake. And I thought, no, what's he talking about? This is ridiculous, what a strange thing to say. And I said, well, I'm a photographer, I should be able to examine them myself and see if there's something true about this. So I did. And the more I looked, the more I found evidence that it was not quite correct. There was evidence that they had been manipulated. And I have a few of the photographs here, which we could have a look at.
Please,
If you like to see it. So the talk I have just given here in Holland is entitled The Apollo Moon Landings, Fact or Fiction. So we look at what are the facts, we look at what is the fiction.
Okay.
This is one fact. This is the National Geographic cover of December 1969. It shows the moon landings. This is Yuri Gagarin. Now,
just a moment. Markus Allen has got now his laptop here available on the table, and we are filming this interview as well. So if you would like to see what he's talking about and see the visuals of his presentation, you can later go to the site of Argusoog and look at the movie that's being placed upon there.
Okay, now that's good, because people can then examine it themselves.
Exactly.
And this is the point I make, that it's not my interpretation you should believe. You should look at it yourself, and you may agree with me, you may disagree with me. If you disagree with me, well, you come along and hit me. If you agree with me, then have a look and see why you agree. This photograph here we're looking at now is of President Khrushchev welcoming Yuri Gagarin as the first man to orbit the Earth. Now, one of the points that is generally raised when I do these presentations is that, well, if what you say about the Americans faking the evidence, surely the Russians would have had a motivation to expose the Americans and say, look, because up to this time, this is 1969, the Russians had been successful in space exploration. They had had the first rocket to the moon in 1959. They'd put the first man into space in Yuri Gagarin, and they'd put the first woman into space. They'd been very successful. And everybody thinks, well, Yuri Gagarin, he's the first man in space. No, he wasn't the first man in space. He wasn't the second, he wasn't the third, he was the 10th.
Okay.
And the reason that one can say this with a degree of confidence is to do with two Italian brothers who were recording the Russian space flights. And here we have the based in Milan, they were ham radio operators who listened in to the broadcasts from the Russian spacecraft, and they heard people very, very frightened. They were dying. the rockets were not landing properly. Yuri Gagarin's rocket did land, but before Yuri Gagarin was another cosmonaut called Vladimir Ilyushin. He was the son of the aircraft designer, Ilyushin Aircraft. He was a chief test pilot. He was a very successful aviator. And he went into space 1 week before Gagarin. He successfully landed in China. His rocket came down in the wrong country. He was also very badly injured because the rocket didn't slow down quickly enough. So it landed very hard. He was badly injured. The Chinese looked after him, nursed him back to health. And the reason that we know that this is the degree of evidence here is that when Gagarin flew a week later, and by the way, he parachuted out of his spacecraft, and now we know why he parachuted out, because they couldn't be sure it would land softly enough so that he would still be alive, because they landed their craft on land. He parachuted out, and he was okay. So he was fated as the most successful Russian cosmonaut. But he wasn't the first. So the Americans knew this. So if the Russians had said, oh, the Americans are faking it, the Russians would have, and the Americans would then have said, well, the Russians were faking it too. So we have to look at this.
Okay, he kept his other in balance.
Yeah, you have to have a balance to it. Yeah. So we know that the Russians were faking things also. And if we have a look at a couple of pictures here.
But what happened to these first? Because you say Gagarin was the 10th yes. cosmonaut that was sent into space.
Yes.
What happened to the other ones? The 8 before, you mentioned this illusion. But what happened to the 8 before that?
They were killed.
All by the landing crash.
Some by landing crashes, some by the spacecraft actually did go into orbit around the sun.
Okay.
It couldn't land. The retro rockets, which is the way the Russians slowed the spacecraft down, they didn't work properly, and the spacecraft continued. Some were just went into orbit. Some did crash and were killed. And in fact, there are a couple of photographs here which show Sergei Korolev. He is the head of the Soviet space program, and you'll notice that some of them get airbrushed out of the pictures. And this is what happens. If the cosmonaut died, they just don't appear in the pictures again.
Okay.
So we have people missing. So, continuing on with the Americans, the American space program was led by that famous Nazi officer, Werner von Braun, who used slave labour in Germany to construct the V-2 rockets to fire at London. Thanks, guys. He is now head of the American space program. He's a very good publicist, and he gets together with the US president at the time, John Kennedy. He gets together with Walt Disney, who we know is a very good creator of fantasy. And he designs even something which Stanley Kubrick used in his film 2001. If you're going to create a space program, you're going to practice what you do.
Of course.
If you're going to practice what you do, you recreate as closely as possible the environment and the conditions that you think you're going to meet. And here we have evidence of the moon being created, parts of the moon being created. Nothing secret about it, perfectly logical, because if you're going to simulate a landing on the moon, you want to be sure that the astronauts, when looking out of the windows of their spacecraft, see the moon approaching them. And the way you do that, you film it on a track here, so it's as realistic as possible.
Sure.
Again, nothing secret about it. I'm not going to start talking about secret places in Nevada where this whole thing, this wasn't staged in Nevada, this was done quite openly. Here we have Langley in Virginia, the structure that was built in order to experience what it